This video will learn about JavaScript functions, how you can define functions in JavaScript, how you can invoke functions, and what are the how arguments are passed and how arguments can be accessed. And also we'll learn about the scope, how scope is defined in JavaScript, and what are anonymous functions, and finally we'll end with closures. So let's get started. So functions are very important. They are the fundamental modular unit in JavaScript. Functions are like any other language, a block of code. If you want to call a code again and again, then you can put that code in a function. Function objects are linked to function.prototype, which is itself linked to object.prototype. Right, we saw that every object has a proto object, so similarly function has a proto object, which is function.prototype. Function can be stored in variables, objects, and arrays, and function can be passed as arguments to functions, and functions can be returned. So it's very important. So functions are a bit different. Their whole process is bit different in JavaScript, where you can assign a variable, a function to a variable. You can have functions inside an object, which are called methods. Of course, in arrays you can pass functions to other functions as arguments. So we will see maybe in videos which will follow that functions can be passed to another function, like a callback function is passed to set timeout, and that callback function is called after some time, and functions can be returned from other functions. This is also very unique to JavaScript, where they are returned. Okay, so functions, this you can define function simply, and you can call the function as well. So we will define a simple function and assign it to a variable. So I can say um, sum is equal to, I can say var sum is equal to function, and two arguments it has, and return a plus b. Okay, now I have defined a function and assigned it to some variable, and I can then simply call it by something like this. So very simply we define a function, assigned it to a variable, and called it. Okay, going forward, function little, like what we did right now, we assigned the value of a function to a variable. Right, that's how you can simply create functions, and function literal can appear anywhere. Okay, now moving forward, function invocation, that is when you call a function. Right, there are four methods or four patterns of invoking in JavaScript: the method invocation, the function invocation pattern, the constructor invocation pattern, and the apply. So we'll study all these four. This apply, except we won't study because I've not seen much in real practice. Right, the other three I have seen, so we will see how the other three you can use. So the first, the method invocation. So here very simply I have defined an object literal, right, my object, and which has one property value, one property increment, which is a function, it's not a static property. Right, and then when I call this on this object, then this function is called. So very simply, like we saw in the object video, that objects can be defined with object literal. There one property I can define, one properties value I can define as a function. That is method 1. Method 2 is simple invocation, right, where we define a function, give it a name, and then call it. So very simply we can do it. Simple example. So I defined a function sum, now sorry, add, which simply returns the sum of two numbers, and then when I call add, I can get the result. So the more general kind of behavior, right? Then constructor invocation, this is using the constructor function, the classes which have been now converted to classes. Here also we can define function as a method. So say I have a class, right, where I have put it one property I've given, then I can add another property, get status, which is a function, and then whenever I create an instance of that function, then this method will be called. Okay, arguments are a bonus parameter that is available to functions when they are invoked in is the argument array. It's not directly an array, it's mostly an array like objects. Array has length property, but it acts. So let's see simple example, this one only. So function add, what I will do is I will say console.log arguments.length arguments. Okay, so you see the color also changes, and whenever I will invoke this function, that means whenever I call this function, this line will, so you can see 2, because the length of the arguments is 2. I can also get the access to each argument. If I say or 1, right, and then I call it on this, then I should get 5, right. So the second argument is printed. So a very good way to work with arguments, where argument function if we have, then in our function we can access it. Here is a simple example. What is defined here is a function which we are not defining how many arguments it takes, right. How many arguments will be passed. What we will do is one by one we'll iterate over each argument, and then we will add it to some variable, and then it will return. So very simply uh, here it's defined, right. So I've defined a function sum, and any number of arguments I can pass, right. So very nice application of this arguments. Okay, where some, sorry, right. So this was where some, the name of the function, I put it wrong. So you can see any number of argument, I don't even need to decide. So how this is working, because we have the arguments object, array like object, and then we are iterating over it and we are adding it. Okay, now moving forward, scope is very important. Scope defines the access limits of each variable. So if you want to remember, just remember that JavaScript has function scope, which means inside the function all the variables which are defined are available, but those variables are not available outside the function. But any variable which is defined outside the function is available inside the function, right. And that variable of course should not be in a in another function. So very simple example we will see, right. So here what I am doing is I defined a variable a, and then I'm trying to access that variable in another function. Okay, right. So whenever I'm defining outside a function, this is in global context, this is in global scope, so I should be able to access this in this function, but this b I will not be able to access outside the function, right. Say I can say function test, right. Let's see, let's call test, and I see the 5 is printed. So a is 5, which is printed here, right. But if I try to access b, then I get a b is undefined. Why? Because it was defined inside this function. The scope was only limited to this function. We can easily check that scope if I just printed b also here. Of course it's defined, so it will be accessible, right. So you can see b I print, a I printed, b I printed, right. It is accessible, but outside the function b is not defined, right. So the function scope in JavaScript, the scope is only functional, right. Function defined in global scope can access. Function defined, sorry, inside another function can also access all the variables. So this is about the uh, closures. So we'll just look at closures in a while. Okay, anonymous function, very small concept. Anonymous functions means they don't have a name. So right now when we had seen that sum etc, any function, we had given it a name, right. Here we said add, right. But you can of course have functions like we defined earlier, which didn't have a name, we defined it to variable, something like that. So these are anonymous functions, don't have a name. Generally there is a function keyword, then there is a name, and then the argument parenthesis, then the function definition starts. But this name is optional, and any function without a name is anonymous, right. These are also called lambda functions. Okay, moving to the last concept, which is closures. So you may nest a function within another function, and nested inner function is private to containing outer function. So basically what closures mean is a function inside a function, right. And the main sort of importance or use of this is when we want to encapsulate certain functions or certain parameters inside another function, then we can use it. Okay, so closure, if you want to talk about the technical definition, is a combination of function and the lexical environment within which the function was declared. Okay, the environment consists of local variables that were in the scope. We'll just see one example, then you will understand, but for simplicity it's just function which is defined another inside another function. We'll take one example of closures. So say we have add square. Maybe I will have this. Let's see what is happening. Okay, I have God. So add square function, right? So I have defined one function add square, which inside has another function square, right, and return. First we'll check if this works or not. So 1 comma 1 1 comma 2. Okay, so this works. So inside this function add square we have another function square. Okay, and we are calling it here. But if I try to call it from outside, it says square is not defined, right, because it's defined inside the function. Remember, the scope is always functional for any JavaScript function or variable. This won't be able to you won't be able to access this from the outside, so it's like a private function of this function, right? And but inside you can call it, of course. Here we are calling it. Okay, so to encapsulate, these closures are used. So here it's just written that the inner function forms a closure and the inner function can use the arguments and variable of outer function. So closure is square, not add square. Okay, while the outer function cannot use the arguments of variable of the inner function. Okay, so last example, another use case of closures is creating a function factory. Okay, what this means is based on certain input you have to create a function, right, which are very similar in nature. So here you can see that I've created a function make header and then returning another function. Remember in the start we said that functions can be assigned to variables, can be returned from variables, sorry, can be returned from functions. So here we see that a function is returning another function, right, very unique to JavaScript, right? So here we can simply create two sort of we can use this function factory to create two functions very quickly, and then we can do whatever we want. So this is another good example of closures where we can use a function to create another function. So one example is, say, in web, if you want to create 5 buttons of which change the size of the body text to different pixels, you can very easily use closures and create different functions, and on click you can assign that value. So yeah, this is it. Very much about functions. Very simply, we can define functions. We can assign it to one method of an object, right? This is more sort of traditional definition. We can use it in constructor functions, which are classes. We can also use the arguments uh, parameter, which is available to us. Scope we defined is the functional scope. Only inside the function are those variables which are defined inside can be accessed, and anonymous function we saw. And finally closures can be used to keep certain functions or variables private, and can also be used as a feature factory, sorry, function factory. So yeah, this is it. Any question, please let me know. Yep, thanks.